Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special edition of the Atacs podcast. We are adults. We talk about cool stuff. It is New Year's Day 2022. Welcome to the new year. I am your host today, Flex, joined by Nate from Clayton, North Carolina. How's it going, Nate?
Good. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well, sir. I'm also joined by Will from, where are you at now, Will?
I'm actually in somewhere where you guys might be familiar. It's called Wendell. I think
this is legendary.
I think that Paul has had a lot of adventures trying to figure out how to pronounce this city, and I don't really know how to pronounce it either. So we're gonna go with Wendell. That's where I'm at.
I think, Nate, is that the correct pronunciation of Wendell?
No, I think we need to go with Wendell.
That doesn't sound right.
This is starting out. It's already starting out contentious this year. Welcome to 2022, everyone. We'll draw the lines, the battle lines right here.
And that other voice you hear is Ryan from New York City.
Hello. Happy New Year, everyone.
And I am from Raleigh, if I didn't say it, and we are gathering here to talk about our favorite video games from 2021. We reached the end of the long year, and we have some favorites to chat about. So we're going to go through 11 games in total and briefly talk about why each of them struck a chord with us, why they were among our favorite games of the year. We will try to keep this, we are aiming to keep this spoiler-free. Maybe walk the line a little bit on that, but for the most part, it's going to be no spoilers.
And maybe before we start on the list, this was something I haven't had a chance to ask the team yet. But how'd you guys feel about 2021? Just in terms of games. In terms of games. I'm sorry. This is usually our game cast. I will leave it. That's what we came here to talk about. How did you guys feel about the games in 2021? And I guess just for me personally, since I guess I asked the question, I will kick it off to say that I thought 2021 was a good year. I thought there were tons of games that I wanted to play and some that I didn't have time to play. And I'm pretty happy with most of the games that I had to play. I don't know if anybody has any kind of broader picture thoughts on the year. I know 2020, obviously, we saw things slow down a little bit for obvious reasons, but and there were still a lot of good games in 2020 as well. But in some ways, maybe stuff that was planned for 2020 just kind of ended up landing in 2021 instead.
Yeah, I think 2021 to me actually felt like the slowest year in a while, especially in the AAA front. I think a lot of games managed to get out in 2020 still because they were basically done. I think 2021 is actually the year that got hit by COVID and supply issues. So a lot of stuff a lot of big games got delayed out of 2021.
I think,
but there was still a ton of games, especially in the indie space. So I still think it was a good year overall.
I don't know. I would say for my taste, it didn't quite, it wasn't quite a great year, 2021. And I guess I had an interesting perspective on this because, I waited until April to sort of put together my game of the year list for 2020. And so with this new format that I'm doing where I just put in, whatever I played, regardless of the year it came out, I actually ended up putting some games that were technically in the running for 2020 on my 2021 list because technically I played them during 2021. So for me, it was kind of a clear evidence that it was a stronger year. I think I had a game at number 3 that I actually didn't even make the cut on my 2020 list. So at least for me, it was a little bit of, and I think a lot of the games that I was really looking forward to were kind of disappointments. Things like Outriders, Back for Blood, I was immensely looking forward to, and it really didn't quite pan out the way I had hoped it would. And a lot of shaky issues getting started, a lot of growing pains on that game. So yeah, there's just a couple pieces like that, but there was still a lot that was good. So throwing it out there.
Well, with that, unless you had any thoughts there, Nate.
Nothing really that you guys didn't already say. I thought it was a pretty good year overall. Lots of variety, I think, is the main thing that I came away with looking at the releases from this year. Just a wide variety of, especially like you said, indie games. I feel like even if there weren't like the big tentpole releases that a lot of critics and others agreed on as like major release that was going to win all the Game of the Year awards or whatever, I think everybody could at least find some stuff that they really liked this year.
Yeah, I do agree with that the variety was really good, and pretty much anyone's going to be able to find something. And we found some games. We found at least 11 of them between us that we're going to talk about that we liked a lot.
Never before heard of top 11 games of the year.
What? It was so good, we couldn't contain it in 10.
This list goes to 11.
A little behind the curtain of how we arrived at this list is we talked amongst ourselves about our own personal top 10s, and turns out there were 7 games that appeared on multiple of our lists. So we figured we'd talk about the games that multiple of us liked a lot, and all 4 of us are going to have a personal pick as well. So that adds another 4. And that brings us to 11 games. And we're going to talk about these in no specific order. So this is not a countdown or a ranking or anything like that. We are, in fact, going to do it randomly. I have written all 11 of these on pieces of paper. I don't know if the mic's picking this up. I'm shaking it. They're in a bowl. And I'm going to pluck them one at a time.
You sure it's not a big tumbler of ping pong balls with them professionally printed on there that you're spinning around there? That would be better if we did that.
Actually, it is that. I paid top dollar for this. This is a high-quality production podcast.
Okay.
Only the finest for our listeners. And
first up,
I think it's time to dig into these games, these video games. What do y'all say?
I say aye.
Perfect. All right. Well, first up, I'm going to hold it up into the camera. I don't even know.
Oh,
this is rigged.
No, see, I wanted to go last.
Who's number one now?
So I drew my name, which means it's my personal pick.
What is your personal pick that was not one of our consensus picks? Is the caveat here.
Correct. Yes. So this is just me picking a game I want to talk about as one of my favorites of the year that was not on anyone else's list. It was only on mine. And that game is going to be Chicory, A Colorful Tale. I think you've started it, Nate, perhaps?
I've been playing some of this on the Switch with those touch controls. It's a cool game.
How do the touch controls work? Do they work well?
It works pretty well. I think it would still probably be better with a mouse, if I had to guess, because you have to hold the Switch with one hand and to draw, which is kind of awkward, and I'm still probably not as accurate with my finger on the little Switch touchscreen as I would be with a mouse, but it probably doesn't actually change the fact that I can't paint in that game to make anything look decent anyway, which I feel like maybe I'm not alone in that.
That's the magic of Chicory, is that I am terrible at painting, and it's still fun and makes you feel like... It's funny because the game, like, anytime you paint anything, like, I don't know if you've gotten this far, but there's like this art academy in there where you like go and take these art lessons, and it'll be like, all right, everyone draw, they have something that they want you to draw. Is like
Express Joy, I think was the one I got.
Yeah, Express Joy, and I just like draw a star, and then
and they're like, wow.
Yeah, and they're all just like, oh, that's amazing.
It's great.
So it's a really positive game in that way. It's just very like, I mean, the word colorful is in the title, but it is a very colorful game. The whole world is a blank canvas that you can color in. So like as you're walking around, and the reason we're talking about controls for anyone not familiar is you control walking your character around. It's like a 2D Zelda perspective, like a top down. So I played it on PC, so I was using, WASD to walk around, and then my mouse was the paintbrush, and as you're walking around, you can just paint anything. So you can, the whole world is basically a coloring book. It's basically an empty coloring book that you're painting. And it has a really charming look to it, and the painting, I think, I don't have any artistic talent, but the painting still feels pretty good, and you have a way where you can like automatically fill in the lines. So if you just, want to do simple, fill colors everywhere, you can make that look pretty good regardless of your talent. And I think it's just like, I think that's a neat thing to just walk around the world and paint in. And when you like look at your world map, you can see everything you've painted, and it's persistent. Like if you travel between areas, it's all persistent. But what I like about the game is other than it just being very charming, is I like how everything kind of melds together. Like your central action, your central verb is painting. So you use the paint to do the little combat. The game doesn't have very much combat, but the little combat you do, there are a couple bosses you're painting for. All the puzzle solving is painting. The platforming that's in there is painting. So like you're interacting through the world via painting, and narratively that's also your job. You're early on in the game, you acquire the brush, and you are a quote unquote wielder of the brush, and that is literally your job, is to supply color to the world. So I think it's a unique mechanic, and it's tied into the narrative smartly. And I really appreciate that kind of like cohesiveness. And then also, as the game goes on, the narrative, I'm not going to spoil anything, but the narrative touches on a lot of like, I guess I'll say mental health stuff, but also like it gets very personal, and it's a lot of
seems to be tied in a lot with like struggling with the creative process, or being somebody in power and not knowing what to do, and a lot of the things that the main character is feeling are very clear. And also, like, if you're somebody who doesn't really know how to draw well, you're probably feeling too when you get this giant canvas and this magic paintbrush. It's like, I don't really know, but I'm trying to help these people. And it does seem like that's tying into the narrative the further I'm getting in. I haven't really seen where that goes yet, but it seems like it's starting to touch on some pretty emotional, pretty real things.
Yeah. Imposter syndrome's another phrase that comes to mind, because your character comes in control of this brush, and they're like, I don't know, am I doing a good job? I don't know. Like there's a whole lot of doubting and that kind of stuff. Which if you're not artistic, maybe you're feeling the same thing there. But even if, even removed from that, like the narrative, the story, I think does a good job of like capturing those feelings that anyone might have about anything. That's like, when they're doubting themselves or don't think they're doing a good job. And I think just the whole story is written really well. And by the end of the game, like I think it's written, like it comes across as very honest and sincere. And I really liked the story, and I liked the way that it ties in with the mechanics. Like I think of every game I played this year, it's the way its story and mechanics like combined was more effective than anything else I played. And I liked just the raw mechanic stuff. Like it's a fairly simple, like top-down 2D Zelda-ish type of game, but like I think the world's super charming. I liked talking to the characters, like the little side quest. Some of the other characters in the game actually have a lot of depth to them as well. They have their own story threads that are pretty touching by the time you resolve them. Like there's like a bully in the art academy, and like they have a whole story arc that like, you know, you kind of see why they are the way they are, and you know they have their problems too. So like I think a lot of that stuff just like comes across really well. And just like the different areas of the game, like you basically have a handful of dungeons and there's a lot of secrets to explore and find, and like all of that stuff I thought was just really fun to explore. And I had a really good time like the whole time I was playing. It was like this game just feels like a very well crafted, like very unique and artistic experience that it just felt right like the whole way through. And obviously if it's not obvious, like the story also like really connected with me. So I just really like the whole package, and it was a nice, charming game, and y'all should play it.
It seems neat from what I've played so far.
Yeah, I'm planning on it if I can get to it. I think initially, you know, I had played what's the one before, but by that developer where the guy's like with his Wander Song. I tried.
Right?
I tried Wander Song last year, and I just like couldn't get into it. So I think I was a little bit reluctant on Chicory, but everything I've heard about it makes it seem pretty spectacular. And then, of course, that inclusion of local co-op, I'm planning to play that with a friend, and I'll report back to you kind of how that affects things. Hopefully, the story will still kind of, you know, hit in certain ways, even with the addition of another player.
Yeah, I hope so. I don't know how well it plays on other platforms. That's part of why I was asking about the Switch. I played on PC and it controlled well. I think it's also on PlayStation and Switch. I'd be curious how it feels on PlayStation, but that's beside the point. But yeah, unless anyone else has any comments or questions on Chicory, I think we can pull our second game. All right. Next up, we have... All right, we're getting the individual picks up front. We got Nate.
All right.
Oh, nice.
My pick was going to be Ender Lilies, Quietus of the Nights, but instead I'm going to cheat and say in a year of really good Metroidvanias, Ender Lilies is a really good Metroidvania that really worked for me. And instead I'm going to say, guys, earlier today I finished this game called Boomerang X, which is a pretty short. It took me less than 4 hours to finish, start to finish. So I started it the other day and just finished it today. Just very tight focused action game where you see through a series of arena battles. You have your one weapon, this boomerang that you throw and it comes back to you. You left click to throw it, charge it to throw it further, right click to bring it back to you. Or if you don't right click, it'll come back to you after just a minute. And you get all these movement abilities or different types of special attacks that you unlock throughout the game. Essentially just make you a time-bending acrobat ring throwing god. And you through these battles. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, from what you're describing, I'm getting like a boss rush vibe. Is this like a Titan Souls type thing, or?
So I've really played it. It's like, I would describe it as like a... I mean, it's you're not shooting guns, you're throwing a boomerang, but it has a kind of like 90s Doom or Quake type look, and it's like a series of battle arenas. And they have multiple enemies in each arena, but it's like a series of like a dozen or so arenas that, you know, escalate in difficulty and complexity.
Okay, like first-person shooter arena?
Yes, it is a first-person shooter.
Yeah. Okay.
You have a jump, but you stop using it after a while because you can teleport to your boomerang after you throw it, which is one of the first abilities you get. So you can basically stay in the air as long as you want, as long as you keep throwing your boomerang and teleporting to it. That's kind of the core gameplay mechanic. And yeah, you get these increasingly treacherous arenas with lava flows and lava pits, and spawning in all these different enemy types, from just kind of floating insects to saw blades that are flying through the air tracking you down, to enemies that continuously spawn other enemy types until you defeat them, to things that grant other enemy types shields, and bigger sort of mini boss style enemies that have multiple points you have to hit to defeat them, and have like huge area of effect attacks that are really hard to dodge. And so it just is really, really well crafted encounters in very well designed arenas around the abilities of this game. Just hit you against the hordes basically and say, figure out how to make it through this wave. And you unlock a few new abilities throughout the course of the 3 or so hours that it takes to get through all the levels. And it is a little like the only thing I don't have anything negative to say about it because I like short games. It's a little slight, but other than that, like, it's basically for me, for my tastes, and for what types of action I enjoy, it's like a perfect distilled action game.
Yeah, it is very distilled, and it's very focused on, like, it's a very fast-paced, like, I guess I'd say twitchy, like, action. Like, you have to be very precise, especially by the end of the game.
Very fast, very precise.
Yeah, but it is very focused on what it does, because, like, the only weapon you have the whole game is the boomerang, and you get, like, other abilities around that, but it is very focused on that core thing. And I think it's probably intentional to give you the teleport as soon as possible, because, like, by the halfway point of that game, I definitely got the impression that, like, they don't really want you ever touching the ground. Like, you're basically just flying around.
Yeah, two of the abilities you get pretty early that are essential to the feel of the game are teleporting to your boomerang after you've thrown it, and then holding down, if you're playing on PC, holding down shift while you're charging your boomerang to slow time temporarily. So you can kind of spin in the air and pick your next target. And then when you get a kill, that timer, that very short slowdown timer refills, so you can kind of bounce between enemies teleporting to where they were, slowing down time, spinning in the air again to pivot to figure out what you're going to do next, charging up special abilities by performing acrobatic moves or doing certain things, and then using those special abilities to take out the higher value targets or to help reposition yourself or give yourself some safety. It all flows together so well. It feels so good. It's one of those games that when I'm playing it, I'm just like clenching my mouse and like in the zone. And then you come out of it and you're just like, woo, okay, yeah, I got through that one. What's next?
Yeah, it's for how, you called it maybe slight earlier, but for how simple it is, like, between the enemy variety and the handful, probably like 4 or 5 or so abilities you do get, like, you're always on the move. You're always, like, having to think about what you need to target. You're having to make accurate shots while flying through the air and juggle your special abilities, which you get 2 or 3 of, I think, like things that charge up based on however many enemies you kill and stuff. And, like, you're always juggling stuff. Like, it's a very active game, and, like, it's they make good use of what they have in there.
Nate, I wonder if you would like. There's a game I tried earlier this year called Severed Steel.
I've had that on a list for a while, and I haven't actually played it yet. But if you think that sounds similar, then I might like it.
It does. It does seem pretty similar, like in terms of just the nonstop adrenaline. Let's rock today of it. Yeah, I think that might be where you're at. So anyway,
another game from a few years ago that I also liked, but not nearly as much as this one was, that it made me think of, was Devil Daggers.
Right.
And out of curiosity, like, does the game try to offer any, like, New Game Plus or hard modes or challenge or anything like that?
There is a New Game Plus mode that unlocks when you beat it, and there's also an endless mode that's like a score score chasing mode that has a leaderboard and everything. So there's a little bit more to do when you finish it for sure. If you want more of that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. I'm just saying it because I do like action games, but like quote unquote boss rush games don't always click with me because sometimes they're just too short. I played Eldest Souls this year, and it helped me that game had like a kind of a quote unquote +1, where it added some mechanics. But I think if it had just been the base game and then like done, it would have been way too short. It would have been unsatisfying.
Sure. Yeah, that's my pick. Just a pure adrenaline rush action game for me.
Yeah, that was Boomerang X.
Boomerang X.
I also played and enjoyed that. Not quite on my top 10, but it's a good game. All right, shaking the bowl. And our next one is, I don't know if this is right side up or upside down. Can you read that at all?
That looks
We got
like
it.
Psychonauts 2.
Psychonauts 2. So I know Will, Nate, and I played this because it was on all of our lists. Did you play this, Ryan?
I didn't get to that. I think I only played a little of the first one, and it didn't really click with me. So two hasn't really been on my radar.
Yeah, Psychonauts 2 has been. I mean, the first game came out in like 2005, so it's been a hot minute. And I mean, Psychonauts 2 basically picks up right after that game. Like it.
Yeah, it's weird.
There was a VR game in between Romulus of Ruin or something like that.
Rhombus of Ruin.
Rhombus of Ruin. But I mean, I think that was pretty short. So, but yeah, do you want to kick us off on this one, Will?
Sure.
What did you like about it?
Yeah, I had it at number 6, kind of on my 2021 list. I think it's really creative. I think that's one of the things I've always kind of appreciated about Tim Schafer in general, but especially with this one. Each of the mines that you kind of, I guess, what would you call it? Invade, maybe. Each of the mines that you invade are very kind of unique and tailored to the particular person, that you're trying to sort of convince or that you're trying to sort of bring around. I think I also like the fact that there was kind of an allusion to this idea that you sort of, you can't really make somebody do anything, I think that was sort of a theme almost. Like, even if you can kind of get in their mind, there's repercussions to sort of trying to manipulate someone. I like the, with me, I always like creating builds, so I had certain skills that I liked. I had certain patches that I liked to use. There were certain, you could kind of go in certain directions with those sorts of things. And I also like the manifestations of certain types of like psychological phenomena. Like, one of the enemies is like a panic attack. And then there's like, your internal sensors, which sort of kind of try and prevent you from sort of thinking certain things. They run around with the little stamps that say no. I thought the little open world aspect of it was kind of fun. It's just a really creative game. Of course, it feels a little bit less creative this time around, because the first one was like 15 years ago, and some of the tricks that this one uses are pretty similar to the last one. And that's probably why it didn't. I think, I don't know if anyone else had it higher than 6. I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Yeah, and I think that's probably part of why, is just because, it does retread some of the same steps, but it remains creative, and there's not really much else out there that's like it. And then, of course, if you've got any nostalgia towards Rasputin Aquato, then that's going to play into kind of how much fun you have with it. But I guess those are some of the things, the build, the creativity, those sorts of pieces. And then, of course, the mines themselves are very interesting. So,
yeah, it is super creative. I really like how they try to represent all those different mind spaces, and a lot of the levels are like melding together of different ideas that make them, very fine style of wacky that works for sure. And I do do definitely echo your point of like how they try to touch on like a lot of psychological or psychiatric topics. Like I feel like they had a hard line to walk making a sequel to Psychonauts in 2021, where like I think people are more aware of like mental illness or like different ways that people have of thinking about things or seeing the world, or like to maybe not try to be like ableist about how we approach things in these types of stories. And I think they actually like find a good way to say like, yeah, what these Psychonauts do can be kind of messed up sometimes, and it can cause a lot of problems, and like it's a lot of power and responsibility to carry, and like how that manifests in the larger plot of the game, which we're not going to spoil, but all the main characters like of the Psychonauts universe like, have a lot of issues that have arisen from their previous exploits that they have to contend with, and it doesn't ever really get like super dark and serious, but they handle it well.
Yeah. I actually didn't feel like it got quite as serious. The first one, there are allusions to things that are very serious, but it never quite like really messes you up in the same way, I guess.
Right.
I remember there being some sort of room you could stumble into in the first game, and it was like alluding to the fact that these children somehow burned to death or something like that, and I was like, oh my god. But I don't remember that happening in this particular one. But just to kind of give one more example of those little things, and this is an element that was present in the first game, but one of the things that you can find, and Ryan, I don't know if you'll remember this from the little time you spent with it, is mental baggage. You'll find these suitcases that are crying, and then if you find the right tag, you attach the tag to the suitcase and clear out the mental baggage. So it'll take a lot of these little like cobwebs, and like, I've got mental cobwebs because my memory's bad. It'll take little turns of phrase like that and turn them into physical elements in the game, which I think is kind of a clever, interesting thing.
Yeah, which is also how they just fill out their 3D platformer with tons of different collectibles, and they managed to make pretty good 3D platforming levels. Like for a 3D platformer in 2021, I actually had a lot of fun just exploring those levels and finding things, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it definitely feels like there's definitely an element to it of like, oh, this kind of feels like a throwback platformer from that era in a way, but it does like feel like it does feel good to play, and like searching around and collecting stuff is fun. Probably mostly because the levels are so creative, as we mentioned, but like it does like control well enough by 2021 standards. But yeah, you don't really see that kind of throwbacky 3D platformer collectathon that much anymore. So it's nice that when this one does come along, it is as creative and fun as it is. And yeah, I think for me, it is the creativity of the levels and the art style, especially of the levels. Like all the levels are just like really evocative of the person's mind that you're in. And then also, yeah, just all the narrative stuff, I think kind of wraps up the story. As far as I know, Psychonauts 2 is the end of the story. Like there's not going to be a 3. And I feel like they did a really good job of kind of wrapping up the character threads that started in the first game and like giving it a really good sense of closure. And like all the major characters kind of had, as Will was talking about, like past things that they're having to deal with because of the mind meddling they've done, and like the traumas they have carried with them, and kind of addressing all that, I think is really well done and really well addressed. I think all the characters come across as really, just really strong character work.
And then somehow on top of that, at the same time, like it's a really funny, well-written game. So like they somehow have it all ways, right? Like they tackle the serious issues well, but they also just make a funny game with funny characters that like are charming and fun to be around.
Yeah, getting Jack Black the courage to perform again was just wild.
All right, anything left to say for Psychonauts 2? All right. Shaking the bowl. Our next pick. I think
Loop
my camera's
Hero.
slightly fuzzy, but that is Loop Hero.
All right.
Nice. Yeah, I guess if you guys don't mind.
Yeah, go for it,
Kicking
Ryan.
it off. Loop Hero, and there were a couple other games in 2021, like maybe like Trials of Fire, that kind of did this interesting mashup of like different sort of genres and gameplay mechanics. Congratulations, by the way, in chat, for killing the Lich. But yeah, like Loop Hero is the kind of game that on paper I'm not sure that I would like. Like idle games tend to sound really boring to me. And things like if you describe things like auto battlers, like on paper, sometimes those have traditionally been kind of dull, but Loop Hero I feel like plays a little bit more like a single player strategy game, like almost like a real-time strategy game where you're kind of pausing it and making adjustments.
I feel like you could look at that game and its systems and say, yeah, it's kind of an idle game, but I never felt that way while playing it.
Yeah, it's like there's all this stuff that's going on. Like it's a deck builder and you have tile placement and like, you know, you have inventory management and like it has sort of a meta progression layer. And so like every now and then the middle of a run would slow down a little bit, but usually it's like, you know, your guy kills an enemy, he gets some loot and like, you know, you're checking it or you're like pausing the game so you can like tweak your build and stuff like that. And in some of the harder challenges you kind of have to, right? Like so It was very interesting, that kind of mashup of mechanics. And yeah, I feel like the itch it scratched for me is maybe in some ways similar to playing like certain types of strategy games that were these kind of like single player strategy games. Like, I don't know. It's a little weird to describe, but it has kind of a lot of odd, unusual things combined together.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a roguelike in which I die a lot and then lament the fact that I lost some resources. But yeah, the strategy, constant like reevaluating of your character's build and trying to figure out what cards to place and when. That just core mashup of mechanics really worked for me. This was just one of those games that once I started it, I was just always thinking about it, or while I was playing it, I was just 100% focused on what I was doing moment to moment. It's just kind of one of those games that occupied my brain a lot for the time I was playing it.
Yeah, I think I didn't finish the game. I finished the first act, but I think one of the things that stood out to me the most in the time I played was just like the little discoverability that comes with, like, the game doesn't explain itself much, and you're constantly kind of like discovering these little card interactions or little combos you can do. And like that was to me, I think, the neatest part of just like kind of experimenting with all the cards and like how you place things. And it's clear they put like a lot of thought into those interactions and wanted there to be fun stuff to find and like strategies you can come up with around that stuff. And I thought that was really neat because like that is kind of, to me, that kind of was the strategy layer of like what you're interacting with on the run is like, how can I make use of this the shape of this loop and place things and, you know, kind of get the most bang for my buck out of the cards I have.
Yeah, for sure. And it's crazy how it's like the simplest sounding game ever if you don't describe any of the strategy or meta layer stuff or like the discoverability stuff like you were talking about. It's just like, oh, my guy runs around this infinite loop, and if there are monsters in the way, he just automatically fights them, and you don't have any direct control over what's happening. But once you start seeing how all of like laying down different cards along the path to spawn different types of monsters, or laying cards around the edges of the path to give different stat buffs, and then picking all the different loot options that give these different lists of like traditional RPG stats like health and armor and crit chance and crit damage and all that stuff. Just starts to all like build up into something that is extremely mechanically dense. But I feel like it rolls it out in a way that learning curve is definitely high at first. I think once you get over that initial hump, it's a pretty smooth ride. At least it was for me through the rest of the game.
I also really like the look and sound of the game.
Yes, absolutely. It has a vibe for sure.
Yeah. I didn't mention that when talking about Chicory that it's one of my favorite soundtracks of the year, but I would also put Loop Hero in that bucket. It was like its whole aesthetic is just really good.
Yeah, the two things that each of you mentioned were the two things that kind of came to mind as well. Nate talked about the progression, and Flex talked about the aesthetic, and like the game kind of has this interesting, in addition to its style, it has this sort of interesting little story thread where like I guess you're in this kind of like this like almost like world that's like a void. And then it's like you just kind of your hero starts just kind of walking this path and like trying to find things, like trying to find little bits of like material or reality or whatever. And I don't know that it's anything crazy, but it was kind of a neat little like thematic wrapper around that kind of like walking the loop gameplay.
Yeah, I think that stuff worked well for me. Like, I don't think it's anything profound, but it worked for me. Like, it's a world where everything has been engulfed into nothingness, and you're just trying to scrape out any memories, any semblance of life, any piece of the world that you can find that remains, and build a community together to like reestablish something that matters. It works.
Yeah, I kind of like that as a little like aesthetic touch.
I got burnt out on the grind.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing of the game that, and it can be a big thing. I think that's the one like big hurdle that people could have, or the main hurdle people could have is you got to get the resources to build things.
It's a game about running around a loop and watching your hero kill monsters. That is the core of the game.
Fair. Very fair.
I do agree that there were some of the meta progression in particular, like you had to just kind of do a lot of runs. And Nate, you talked about it being a roguelike. I guess one of the game's mechanics is like trying to decide when to stop a run.
Yeah, you got to figure out when to cut and run so that you don't lose too much.
Which is a nice thing, but yeah, it ended up being like, well, I want to build this thing, so let me do 3 runs, which are going to take like an hour each, and that did feel a touch grindy.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, any more on Loop Hero?
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's one of the weirder and more interesting games I think I played this year. Like, it's a very unique game.
I think even if you don't personally like Loop Hero, it's a cool game to like think about how it works.
Yeah, like I enjoyed what I played of it. I got burnt out that I didn't want to play anymore, but like I'm happy to see what I played, and like it has a lot of neat ideas. All right, shaking the bowl.
All right, what's up?
And we got Hitman the Third.
Hitman the Third, Agent 47.
Assassination.
Yes.
Did you play this one, Mr. Will? Did you get around to this?
I did not. I did play the first 2. So I would say I'm somewhat familiar with the mechanics.
That you are, because
it's the same thing, but there's a third one.
Hitman 3 is more Hitman.
All right.
Which as I was making my list, I was thinking about, I'm like, like how, this is the third game, kind of the same formula. Like where do I put this? Like how do I rate this? And then like as I was thinking about it, I was just like, Hitman 3 is still really good. Like they still hold like the new maps are all very good, and there's still nothing else quite like it. So it's like, even if it's the third one of these and it's very similar to the first two, it's like it's still in the grand scheme of video games like nothing else quite like it. So
Yeah, when it's hitting, I think it's really, really hitting. You know,
mhm.
some of the stories I often found were the most interesting. You know, the pieces like the assassination stories. You know, where they're like, this is a really unique and interesting way that you can take this guy down. You know, I always found that like I was accidentally like missing a wrench when I needed it or missing a screwdriver when I needed it and stuff like that. And sometimes that could get a little bit frustrating. I was curious, did that ever, do you guys go for those stories, or do you have to trial and error your way to get the components that you need, or how does that work for you?
I'll sometimes trial and error stuff, but for the most part, I try to play those games as just I go with whatever is gonna work. So like I'll follow some of those stories sometimes if they seem interesting. If it doesn't pan out and I don't have a screwdriver, I probably got a can of spaghetti sauce that I can use to just get something done another way.
Right, whip up a quick marinara,
Which is basically why I like those games so much.
Yeah, it's a great like these games let you like you can be very planned about your approach, and like you can pull off the quote unquote the perfect assassination, the perfect run, and like just do everything super smooth, or you can go create as much chaos or improvisation as you want. Like the game kind of lets you find your own style. I think I tend to operate somewhere in between. I start with a clean plan in my head, and some improvisation works its way in along the way. I tend to never get the full chaos, but usually at that point I'm reloading because things have gone real bad. But yeah, I just the way the levels are designed, and like all the mechanics, and like the clarity of the systems, like everything's just presented very cleanly, and the game follows clear rules. Like all that stuff just works super well, and just the way the clockwork levels are organized is really fun. And Hitman 3, I think, added, like, I think the last level I don't really care for. It's kind of a different theme.
More of a cinematic moment to end the trilogy than anything. I don't really even think of it like a big standard map.
Yeah, but the other 5 maps were all really good. Like, I really enjoyed all the other maps.
Yeah, the reason I think that Hitman 3 still deserves strongly to be talked about in like games of the year, even though it's the third one and does a lot of the same stuff, is that I think with a handful of the new maps, they take some bigger swings or take some risks or try to mix things up in ways that are still interesting and cool and across the board work. That is pretty impressive for a trilogy to end that way.
Yeah, for sure. Like I think they really stuck the landing on it. And yeah, we had a whole spoiler cast at the beginning of the year after this game came out on the entire Hitman trilogy, where we talked more in depth about the maps. But I think, if I remember correctly, we were both in agreement that for Hitman 3, Berlin was our favorite map.
Yeah, that's a cool inversion of the standard Hitman level.
Yeah, it's got a whole different take on it. That like it's still Hitman, but you go about it a little differently than you normally do. And I think they take some swings, like Nate said, in a handful of the levels that, gives it just enough of a new flavor that it's not super stale, while still also like relying on the core Hitman principles. And I think it's also worth just praising, like there are a lot of games that are very samey for 3 in a row, and by the third one it's just like, it's kind of boring, been here, done that. But like, I feel like I had just as much fun playing Hitman 3 as I did either of the other two, and I feel like that's that's pretty rare for me if I have play 3 games in a row that feel very similar. Like generally by the third one, I'm like not having as much fun anymore just because, I've done it a lot. But I feel like this is the rare trilogy where like I'm enjoying the third game just as much as the first two. And I think that's worth praising. Like the formula they've hit on and the variety they have in the maps has just remained strong enough that like it's still fun.
Yeah, I agree, 100%.
Well, you got anything else you want to say on that one, Nate?
I don't think so. It's a great game and a great end to that great series.
Yes,
yeah,
indeed.
and I think isn't that developer it's IO? I think are they doing a James Bond game or something?
Yep.
They are.
Their
That
next
should
project.
be. It seems like they have the skill set needed to make that pretty awesome.
They absolutely do.
It seems like one of those match made in heaven type of things. Like you always have those theoretical discussions like, oh, what if you gave a different IP to a different developer? Like, what if,
right.
Like, that one just seems like it makes so much sense. It's like, oh, yes, they are the perfect developer to make a James Bond game.
Yep.
All right. And with that, another shake of the bowl. And we are moving on to Wildermyth.
Nice.
Which I believe all of us have played.
Right.
Yeah.
You want to kick us off on this one, Ryan?
Oh, I was gonna say we actually also did a spoiler cast on this one. But yeah, no. The way I think of Wildermyth in some ways, and I think I said this in the spoiler cast as well, is if you take XCOM, like a game like the modern XCOMs, where you kind of have these procedurally generated soldiers, and even though the game doesn't really support it until maybe like the War of the Chosen DLC, it kind of, just the fact that the soldiers kind of have names and, it creates stories, right? Like, I can remember like my sniper named Godfather, he was codenamed Godfather, and I had native languages on, so he like spoke in Spanish. It wasn't Italian, but it was still really funny, like, to have this guy. Or, like I remember like when one of my Rangers like got flanked and took a couple hits and went down, and it was, you kind of remember these little stories. It creates these little anecdotes. Well, I feel like what Wildermyth does is basically that, except they actually put writing and like character development. Like, there's actually procedural storytelling in Wildermyth, and it works surprisingly really well.
It is probably one of the strongest initial reactions I had to a game this year, where those procedural stories start popping up and all these characters have dialogue between each other, and it's all completely like it's all written by writers, but it's also procedurally being pieced together for my specific game, and I was just kind of like, this is magical.
Yeah, the first few stories in Wildermyth, in particular, and your characters, like, it kind of tells you a little bit about like some of their most prominent traits, and then in the dialogue, as you mentioned, like these little comic panels or whatever they use, you'll see your characters, and a lot of times they're speaking in like that poetical or greedy or like whatever, like, or loner, like they'll have their dialogue will sort of reflect sometimes those kind of traits. And yeah, the characters form relationships, and like, if they take an injury, like that was actually one of the most kind of like aha moments for me, is in one of the early battles, I put one of my warriors a little too far forward, and he took a couple hits and kind of did like the XCOM death thing. And so, I had him retreat. It gave me the option to have him retreat, and like he came out with an eye patch. So for the rest of that campaign, the warrior had an eye patch and like an accuracy penalty that was sort of like this permanent, effect or trait for his character. So it does some really cool stuff with like that sort of that sort of like procedural storytelling, I guess. In some ways, like if you're familiar with XCOM, you might have a little hints of that kind of, how those little anecdotes pop up as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really neat when it works.
I would be really curious to see kind of, because I mean, clearly, I think both, Flex and Nate both played it, but it seemed like it didn't make the cut when it came to the end. And I think I'm still in that sort of, and it could, of course, you only make the list kind of where you are currently, and I guess I'm still in that sort of honeymoon phase with it because I've only played it. I saw that a friend of mine had it, and I was like, well, let's do remote play together. And so he basically gave me kind of access to where I can control it with my mouse, and we'll kind of take turns encounters, maybe take turns playing different characters, and so we have a little story going now, and and I'm really loving it. I think a lot of times, and I think I mentioned this in my little write up that I posted earlier. I think there are a lot of times where I feel like, specifically crafted moments are going to hit harder than the procedural ones. And although I still think that's the case, I feel like the references that Wildermyth seems to be making to the characters that I have based on their personalities, what's happened to them, transformations, pets, relationships. I think there's this sort of magic to it. The first time, one of the first things that happened to my party was two of the characters fell in love, and then of course, and if anybody attacks that one character, then the other character gets a bonus to attack. It's almost like, don't you mess with my girl or whatever. And I'm like, man, this is pretty great. And I'm currently kind of interested in not only finishing out the one that I'm doing, but maybe kicking the combat up a notch and then trying some of the other stories. Because right now I'm just playing the second story, which is about the sort of ancient, almost Dwemer, if you remember from like Oblivion. They're like the Dwemer or whatever. But yeah, I guess I'm curious kind of where, whether you saw the cracks, because in some ways, I feel like when you first start playing an Elder Scrolls game for the first time, it's like incredible. And then after a while, you start seeing the cracks. And you're kind of like, okay, I can see how they're stitching this world together. And I wonder if there's a moment like that, where Wildermyth kind of shows its hand, and wonder, is that what sort of knocked it off your you guys' lists, or and I don't know. And I'd also be interested to hear from Ryan whether or not it sort of felt like it had the legs to kind of, were all the stories worth playing? Do you regret any of the time you spent with it?
Yeah, we did the spoiler cast on it, and we talked about a lot of this stuff I think in there too. But to give the short answer, yeah, it definitely saw the seams of that game eventually, and I think probably Wildermyth gets my end of year award for a game I wish I liked as much as I think it's really cool and interesting.
Right.
But, didn't have a bad time with it by any means, and I do think it is really neat what it's going for and how successful it is in the early games, but it did fall off for me pretty hard at some point.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think Nate and I maybe had similar experiences in this. I think the first campaign I played through two campaigns, the first two. And the first one, it was like, oh, this story stuff is really clever. Like, I'm sure it's like more or less procedurally generated stories. Like they have a whole batch of pre-gen ones that can slot together, your narrative Legos. But then the second campaign I played, I got some repeat events that I had in my first campaign. And I was like, oh, I see how this works. And it was like just peeking behind the curtain just enough of like, okay, I get it. Like,
right.
And the magic kind of wore off a little bit. I think also for me, like the combat was maybe not as interesting after so many hours. Like it didn't really maybe have the legs, but because it's a fairly simple tactics game.
Yeah. Although I think the mystic mechanics are pretty unique. I don't know that I've seen much like that before.
They're really cool. I really like how they do their mages.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, Divinity Original Sin 2 also requires you to pay a whole lot of attention to your environment, just like kind of this one does in terms of tactics games that kind of do that. But so far, I found that to be kind of an interesting mechanical piece.
Yeah, but I did have like a good time with the game. Like I got a little burnout on it and wish it had done a couple things a little better, but like it's definitely got a lot of the stuff that Ryan and everyone else has already talked about. Like I definitely like a lot of the ideas they have, and I think a lot of it works pretty well. Um,
Yeah. And I guess from my perspective, Wildermyth did land pretty high on my list overall. And as you mentioned, well, I played 3 campaigns, the first 2, and then I skipped ahead and did, I think it was called the Thrixel campaign. And I did start to see a hint of the machinery in the second, and I saw a lot more of it in the third. But it does take some of the punch out of it, but I still think the kind of just the setting and the writing in general, like I still enjoyed the campaign story arc, and it's still in that one. I think you start as like a brother or you start as 2 siblings. Mine were a brother and a sister, and a lot of the story follows them. And I still think that writing was good in general, even if you start to see some similarities in the way the story is presented, and some of the little character stories, but it's still really unique. And then the gameplay I enjoyed, but it probably held up for me a little better than maybe Flex and Nate, but I think also 3 campaigns is probably like 20 or 30 hours of gameplay, so that was a good stopping point. Initially though, I did consider like trying to get through all the campaigns, but there are, I think, quite a few of them.
Yeah, and I'm so late on the bus. Of course, I didn't catch that spoiler cast just because the procedural aspect of it. I've found recently I've less into turn-based tactics, and I've never really quite been into procedural, so it didn't really check any of my boxes. But I kept seeing it on these end-of-year lists, and of course, a friend of mine owned it, and I was like, well, let me just see what it's all about. And it really did. It makes a heck of a first impression.
yeah, I would be curious I don't know that any of us played because there are the 5 like story campaigns, but then you can do like a purely like randomized campaign. There's like that option, just like a repeatable thing. I guess none of us played that. I'm kind of curious what what those are like.
Yeah, I don't know.
But I think that's going to do it for Wildermyth. Moving on to the next game, and we have, I don't know how much noise I'm making here. We have Monster Hunter Rise.
All right. That's the good stuff.
Yeah, so I'll do a quick intro and then toss it to you, Ryan. But yeah, I know Nate and Ryan played this as well, and all 4 of us got pretty heavy into Monster Hunter World a couple years ago. And this is the next, main Monster Hunter game. And Switch exclusive for now, coming to PC next year. Random aside, I feel like the game runs and looks really good for a Switch game, and that's not meant to be a backhanded compliment. Like, I think it actually does, like, legitimately run well and look good.
Surprisingly so. The Switch has been struggling. Like, sometimes I will avoid playing games on Switch because having to play 30 FPS and watch the frames, drop when anything intensive happens is just, it's getting to be like a drag on that system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mentioned that because, like, I think part of the praise for World at the time was like, oh, we're finally getting off, because Monster Hunter had been on handhelds for a long time. It was like a lot of PSP and 3DS and that kind of stuff. And, everyone praised, oh, finally it's on a console. I can play it on my TV and HD and 4K and whatever on PS4 and Xbox One. And then they went back to, what's basically a handheld system on the Switch. But to me, that's totally fine. Like, it looks great, it runs great. And yeah, like, I mean, Ryan, I have more thoughts here, but Ryan, what was kind of the standout things for you? Like what was it that, even after all the time you put into World, made Rise still, one of your favorite games this year?
Yeah, well, and it's kind of like you said, like having played so much World, it's hard to not connect the two. But obviously I enjoyed World a ton, and that was kind of the Monster Hunter experience was kind of a new thing for me, and it has this really unique combination of like action RPG and like really precise, almost like fighting game or Souls-like combat, which it does incredibly well in these sort of like PvE, like or co-op like versus monster fights. Like it just does a lot of really the series does a lot of really cool stuff there. But then on top of that, Rise does a lot of stuff that for me made it not feel like an iterative sequel. Even though you see a lot of the same DNA, like same weapon sets, same monsters, like, they added, like, for example, the Silkbind mechanics and all that movement, which was great. And the whole combat kind of gets rebalanced around the fact that you're so much mobile now. And, I don't know if it's like because Capcom, they build fighting games, but they just like, they make it feel like an entirely different, like a pretty major iteration of like a fighting game. Like the combat has a lot of a different feel. The weapons have the new Silkbind attacks. Like they've rebalanced a lot of the combat. So like, I played a new weapon, the longsword, and I played a familiar weapon to me, the sword and shield. And, the longsword was new to me, although I think like the kind of the draw slash or the counterattack mechanic was fairly new. They were experimenting with it in Iceborne, and then the sword and shield felt kind of different. Like even though I had played it somewhat in World, like playing it in Rise felt, not like a totally different weapon. Like I still remember, but I had to relearn some combos, like learn to approach the encounters in certain new ways, and then on top of that, like, just like movement on the Palamutes was great. The Rampage quests were great. Like the setting, the Chimera Village setting was very different from kind of the quote unquote new world, or I think was it Astoria or whatever from Monster Hunter World. So just tons and tons of stuff they did to make it feel like a fresh game and kind of recapture some of that like, magic for players like me who are kind of new to the monster hunting experience when World came out.
Yeah, I didn't stick with it quite as long as I stuck with World, but that was probably more just there were other things I wanted to play, but I definitely for the time I played Rise, it was like, all right, I'm all in again. Like it was all the same, kind of those feelings. Like I think Rise changed enough, as you said, that like it kind of felt fresh again, and it was like, oh yeah, like kind of it re-enabled like all those like all that the good stuff that World did. It kind of like reinvigorated it all, so to speak. So like it didn't feel like, oh, this again. It was just like, even though it is a lot of this again, kind of what we were saying about Hitman 3, like it is still a lot of the same stuff, but they do enough to make it just as fun to jump back in again and like fight those monsters and use those weapons. Oh, and as you were talking about the weapons, I used the hunting horn in both World. That was one of the weapons I used in both World and Rise, and they completely changed the hunting horn.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's much simpler to use in Rise than it was in World, but also more fun. It was like, I don't know. I really enjoyed the hunting horn in Monster Hunter Rise. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I think even weapons that didn't get a massive overhaul, like the hunting horn, like it's kind of hard to overstate how much just like the basic movement options change how those games feel to play. It would be hard to go back to a game that doesn't have the wire bug stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the next sequel is going to have that, and that kind of makes me a little worried.
Yeah, like Ryan was talking about this being, an iterative enough sequel, and I think like what Nate said of like it'd be hard to go back. Like I'm in the same boat. Like I think after playing Rise, it would be hard to go back to World or any of the other previous ones, just because like the stuff they've added is meaningful enough that it would be hard to lose it.
Yeah, because like in World, I played the Insect Glaive because it was the one weapon that has a dedicated jump button, and so they added the wire bug stuff to this. I was like, oh, I'm gonna play around with some other stuff, and I ended up settling on the gun lance, which is super fun to use if you're just like able to every now and then like zip to a point and unleash your giant cannon on something. Like completely different feeling from the just full-on tank mode version of it from before.
Yeah, these games definitely. World felt like a tough act to follow, and I was impressed with just how much they did with Rise. And yeah, I mean, I think their next iteration is Sunrise coming out this year, but that's
their DLC for Rise. Yeah,
that's more like I guess G Rank or Iceborne.
Yeah, my guess is that's going to be more comparable to like Iceborne.
Yeah. But it'll be tough for them if they do another big sequel to. It'll be a tough act to follow, but World seemed like a tough act to follow. So
yeah, this is true. And the core Monster Hunter is still fun. Like all the stuff that was fun in World is still fun here. And then there's more to it. And trying to connect with people online is no longer a nightmare.
Yeah. Was it? I think that was true, but do you think that was because they sort of separated the quote unquote hub multiplayer completely from the campaign, or?
I'm guessing that helps, but I still feel like it should have been better in World even without that separated. Like the whole having to watch cutscenes and like juggling all that, like all of that was just such a mess in World. Once you got synced up, it was fine, but getting synced up was hard. And in Rise, it just works, which is extra weird because we're talking about the online component in a Switch exclusive just working, but it did. Any final thoughts on Monster Hunter Rise? Very good game that potentially my most played game of the year, actually, in terms of just like raw hours. I played it quite a bit.
Magnamalas. That still is a kind of a funny name.
And a tough fight the first time I fought him. All right, so next up. Randomly chosen, we have Unsighted.
Unsighted.
I don't know if you played this, Ryan. I know Nate and Will did, and me.
I actually finished it yesterday.
Oh, nice.
All right.
So we have all played it. Yeah, I like this game a lot. It is my favorite game of the year. Is one of those games that just like kind of does everything well. It's one of those video games that you just play it and you're like, all right, this is a video game.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, is like to me the closest touchstone is like a 2D Zelda, but it's, you know, you have this overworld to explore. You're running around, you know, clearing dungeon, fighting monsters, finding secrets, like getting upgrades that allow you to access new areas and
listening to some funk,
other power-ups. Yeah, you got a really bopping soundtrack. I really like the art style. It's kind of like just across the board. Like it's one of those games that just feels like everything it's doing. It's, at least for me, it was hitting everything it was doing. And one of those games that was just like, once I started it, it was like, it just went. It was just like, yeah, we're just, you know, there's no bumps in the road here. We're just going and everything just feels really good. Like, and then the kind of the core mechanic, like the main, because like a lot of that stuff is in a way, I guess, kind of standardish stuff. Like, I think it does it really well. And I think one thing that was interesting, I don't know if any of you thought about this, but like, I think one thing that was interesting is as a Zelda type game, like the keys were universal. So like, I feel like a lot of times in Zelda, like, oh, you go into a dungeon and, you find keys in that dungeon for use in that dungeon, and it's very like self-contained. But I think Unsighted's world is more like fluid than that, and it's like even the dungeons aren't necessarily even like designated as like separate dungeons.
Don't feel as sectioned off. They feel more interwoven with the rest of the world. You'll pop out of a dungeon and be like, "Oh, I'm in this part of the world now."
Yeah, it is interconnected in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I thought that was really cool, and it made the process of like exploring the world to me really, really fun and really rewarding, of just weaving through all that stuff.
I think as someone who's not typically into a lot of like the twitchy, super hard combat, as soon as I got the gun, I was like, hey. And so my main build was actually that automatic, I think whatever gun that you can get that shoots the fastest.
Nice.
And then I basically stacked up gun damage and the reload speed so that my entire chipset was gun damage.
That's great.
So funny.
I actually think this game has a really good set of systems for different builds. But go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, so that was kind of the way I wrote it. And at the end, they stopped supporting it a little bit because they make it to where it's still more. I still found it more effective on the final boss than going melee. But you start fighting those beasts that you're dodging for the whole game. Yeah. And the sword that you get, the one that every time you kill someone, that sword gets more powerful. That is, way, 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 way more effective. There's not a gun equivalent to that. Yeah, so at that point, I had to start engaging with those systems. But those guys telegraph their attacks, and they're pretty slow. Those giant beasts at the end. But I remember being kind of disappointed because I'm like, I don't want to put a sword on. But it was fun.
That actually makes me really happy that like you can do that gun build, because like I use like swords the whole game, and kind of build around that. And I actually really like the feel of the combat in this game, and I think the parrying feels really good. And the combat's based a lot around parrying. But I really like that the gun build worked for you, because I do think, like as Nate mentioned, that like the game's pretty open to like different builds and equipment and styles of play, and I think that is a strength of it. So I'm really happy that worked for you. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, those little chipsets really give you some flexibility.
Yeah, I also something I really liked about the game is that those big monsters that you're not really intended to fight until the end of the game you do run into them just normally, and I kind of appreciated that, because it's like, oh, if you really want to, you can try and take them on, but you're kind of intended to wait. But I think that's a cool, part of aspect of its world design is like you can it's a very nonlinear game. Like you can do the dungeons in any order, and you can if you can brute force your way through those tough monsters, like you can go to those areas that like you're kind of not intended to earlier on.
Oh, and I wanted to, for sure. I spent a long time figuring out how to kill those guys without the end sword.
One tricky piece of it that's funny is I feel like the time pressure piece of it kind of sneaks up on you pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like, so to me, it's like half the game, I was like, well, this guy has the least time and I've got a lot of this dust, so I'm going to give it to him. But then towards the end, it was like they start dropping like flies, and I was like, ah! And
it gets stressful.
So that was kind of tricky, and I was like, who do I? And I was like, my co-op partner was like, hey man, should we give our dust to the martial arts trainer? And I'm like, I don't know, what can he do for us?
Man, it's cold, calculated, like who's doing the most for me? They get that dust.
Yeah,
he's over there mining your ore fields.
Yeah, and then the time mechanic I think is probably this game's most unique thing, which it definitely it can be stressful, and I know some people it stresses out, and I really appreciate that the game lets you turn it off, so like you can play it as like a more traditional type of thing. But I do think it adds something if you stick with it. I do think it adds something both mechanically and narratively, because like the story is about like an impending don't know if apocalypse is the right word, but like for these androids, like they're, you know, their lives are literally on a timer. It's like this impending doom. And I think having that timer makes you feel it in a way that like has material consequences. Like as Will was talking about, it's like you're losing people that do things for you. And you get connected to them. So mechanically, because they do things for you, it has real impact. But, you know, narratively, you also get attached to these characters. It's like, I thought it was a really effective, like, thing that kind of united and covered the whole experience in a really smart way.
Yeah, and the writing really made you feel that they had gratitude for it. You know, when you gave them that dust, they were like, "Oh my God, for me? Are you sure?" Mm-hmm. And you're like, "Yeah, man, keep on living." LIVIN.
And I think also, like, how how often in video games do we joke about, like, oh, you know, we got this world, you know, this thing is going to happen, that, you know, the world's in danger, but oh, I'm gonna go do this side quest to, like, you know, collect this woman's cuckoos for her you know, her chickens, and, you know, the world's not going to actually end until I go off and do the main quest. Like, I feel like it was a really smart way to be like, no, like the world's actually ending and you need to get on it. And if you don't, there are consequences. And like, they really played with that thing that we joke about video games doing all the time.
Yeah, for sure. That really worked for me as I got to the end game that Will was talking about, where things get really dire. Like, I basically swapped my whole build around. I started realizing, like, oh, I'm not finding enough of these dust pickups to actually stave off timers for all of the characters in the game, and I need to start looking at towards the end, and like made the decision that I was just not going to explore the whole world. I wasn't going to find all the secrets. I needed to go and complete the objective to try to save as many of these characters as I could, and then I switched to using just like an axe with the highest damage possible kind of a build to just like try to one-shot as many enemies as possible and run through areas, and like that final dungeon to the final boss, just like getting the notifications that all these characters are expiring.
Oh no!
As I'm like trying my best to get through it as fast as possible. It's so
Didn't
harrowing.
Raquel have a giant axe? Taking the Raquel route? She had a giant red axe.
Doing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it gets real dire by the end if you know, especially if you're doing much exploring. All right. Well, anything else to say about Unsighted before we move on?
Did you like it, Ryan?
I mean, I agree with most of what's been said. I think I don't think it would work if it wasn't pretty well executed and, like, you know, being a Zelda-like, and if it didn't have good combat. And I do really like the design idea, like the time limits. And it also, to me, I kept an eye on it throughout the game. And as you mentioned, like, you know, when I was, you know, fumbling my way through puzzles or like falling off platforms and stuff like that, the time limit was always like, oh, oops, like there's a little bit more of like sort of a consequence to not doing well. And also, I mean, you know, I was thinking about it in the context of like, well, if I do another run, like the fact that I've learned this thing, the fact that I'm better at the combat, like the fact that I know this blueprint and how to craft this item, like I wonder how much time, like how much better I could do if I did another playthrough. It didn't land that highly with me. I didn't love the setting, and some of what it did reminded me a bit of Nier Automata, where you have these kind of like very human acting robots, but then it's kind of like wagging its finger at like human beings, and like I guess Unsighted, I felt like did some of that, and I was like, this just does not click with me. And I feel like the ending played a little bit more into that too. So I didn't love the game, but I do think it was more fun than Nier. So
I can agree with that completely.
I think on it.
All right. Moving on, we have 3 games left, and our next one is Mr. Will's personal pick.
Me?
You.
Well, small chance you telegraphed it. I'm going to talk about Stonefly, which I think the only other person I think who has looked at this is Nate, and he just adored it. And
It's a cool game. I liked it.
It's made by Flight School Studio, who did Creature in the Well before this, which was that pinball inspired game, which I did not play. But I think actually, did you play that one, Flex?
I didn't realize it was the same developer.
Yeah. So I guess the one thing I'm going to go ahead and say up front, the story I'm not sure really did a ton for me. Just kind of Grandpa lost his cool little ship, and that was a special ship, and we need to go get it back.
Okay, they're not just ships, Will. They're bug mechs.
You're right.
Which is way cooler.
But everything else outside of that kind of basic story structure just really, really landed for me. Like I think I really like kind of ARPGs. I like watching my character get stronger. You start with this mech that just kind of sucks. You can just kind of float for a couple seconds and drop like a little tiny bomb. But then as you sort of as you collect resources and as you kind of progress through the story, you unlock a lot of different upgrades, and you can kind of take those at whatever pace kind of works for you. But the loop is kind of going to these different areas, and the areas to me look really cool. They're kind of like pastel. The basic world that you're in is a world where you've got insects are actually bigger than people, and you're driving this bug mech that's basically like resembles an insect, kind of some of the insects that you're sort of fighting and encountering, and trying to sort of get this ship back that has been stolen. And the main thing I think I loved, in addition to, the environment, the music I thought was really good. It had this kind of cool ambiance that kind of added to the intrigue of the whole situation. I just really liked this combat. And, when I talked to Nate about it, he did say it was frantic. And it is kind of frantic. But usually when I would start getting destroyed, I would take a second and I'd go back and look at my list of upgrades, and I'm like, I remember they mentioned this thing a minute ago. I wonder if this could be helpful. And like more times, on a couple of occasions during the game, that made all the difference. Me like trying to integrate this new move. And I guess there are maybe other ways that they could have introduced those mechanics that would have maybe made that learning curve a little bit smoother. But I think so much about the aesthetic presentation of the game worked for me that I was just sort of willing to kind of go a little out of my way to make it work. But I also felt that once I invested that time trying to learn how to fly the ship and learn how to fight these different things, I found like I got a real sense of being super competent. And I also like, I think I mentioned this. I also liked the fact that the way you kill the enemies is not by like dealing them enough damage. You basically, a lot of them are bugs and it's almost like a turtle or something. So you flip them over and then you blow them off of the leaf using this sort of kind of move with your bug mech. And so, you'll use one move that'll sort of pull all the enemies together and flip them over and then land. And then while the enemies are on their shells, like rolling around, then you can like blow them all off the map. And so, as opposed to like, oh, I killed that guy. Oh, I killed that guy. There are some times where you can just like take out like 15 enemies at one time with like one of these like big gusts of wind that you can create. And also there are some times where it almost feels not, it doesn't feel like you're cheating, but in a sense, like you can take out enemies pretty quick if you know exactly how to deal with them. So there are certain types of enemies where, you might bomb them up a couple times and flip them over. And if you know exactly how to pull their shell back and bomb them, even though they're normally really a pain in the ass, like once you realize how to deal with them, you can take them out quick. So I think there's sort of a sense of competency that you gain, when you're actually kind of getting into that whole combat. But it just the whole thing, I think, I like ARPGs. I like developing that sense of competency. I like kind of creating, a build, and I like this sort of world. The explanation I used in my write-up for the game is that it reminds me of Eric Carle. He's like, he's the children's author that wrote The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and I think anyone who's seen it maybe kind of picks up on that a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if Nate has anything he kind of wants to add about kind of what his experience with it was, or.
I think you summed it up pretty well. Like, it has a lot going on, and I think it is cool how it feels so different from just like your stock standard action games of the modern day. Like, learning how to control that mech is a process, and it has like different ways of moving and dealing with enemies than you would find in most standard action games. So it's just like there is that learning curve to it that is fun to figure out, and it feels cool and different in a way I definitely appreciate. And I also say about the controls, like, I like when games have lots of like charge up on all the different moves. Like,
yeah,
it's like, it's not a long charge up, but like you can charge up the jump a little bit to jump further, or you can charge up the wind gust attack a little bit to get more like
to get more blow
power on it. So like everything in this game feels like it has that sort of thing. So I'm always like charging my next move in combat, and it just that feels good. I like that.
Yeah, and there are definitely parts of it that are just like, no matter how good you get, that are just kind of frantic. There are certain types of minerals that you want to get to do your in-game upgrades, and the only way to find them is to basically find these little trails that will lead you to this gigantic monster. And the gigantic monster has all of these minerals on his back. And the longer that you try and get those minerals, like, the more overwhelming that situation gets. So you almost feel like you're doing this sort of hit and run tactic where you're like diving in.
It's like a train heist, but on a giant flying moth.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so you got to get in there, get them goodies, because you get overwhelmed. There's no way to really, strategize your way out of that situation.
You can't fight it.
Yeah.
It's too much.
So yeah, that's but yeah, Stonefly probably the most fun I had. It just and I wouldn't say, I don't know that Stonefly is going to necessarily make the all-time great list for me, but I think it was, in terms of just how consistent I found it to be, I felt like it did everything that it was doing really, really well. And that's always, I think Flex mentioned that earlier when he was talking about, Unsighted a little bit. And so that's always really satisfying when you feel like everything that the game is doing, it's kind of hitting. So that's kind of how I felt.
Is Stonefly like a top-down perspective, or is it like side scroller? Or
it's kind of isometric, I guess, kind of top down isometric.
Sort of like a Grim Dawn style,
well, I mean, maybe the angle.
The angle, yes, but the like I was saying, the gameplay is really like, I've never played another game that feels the way that Stonefly feels to play. It has its own feel. You're piloting this mech by jumping it and doing gusts of wind, and it just feels weird, but it's cool.
Yeah, it's definitely. Yeah, I think it's an action RPG, and it's kind of isometric, but I feel like those are really the only similarities to Grim Dawn.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. That was Stonefly, and we have 2 games left. 50-50, shaking this best I can. And we, next up, are going to talk about whatever Ryan wants to talk about.
Oh, I thought I might be destined to go last, but
nope,
just missed it. So let's talk about Monster Hunter.
All right.
So it's kind of funny because one of the other games I enjoyed a lot this year was also Monster Hunter, but I guess it was Monster Hunter Stories 2. Which, I guess.
So, 2 initial questions. One, did you play Monster Hunter Stories 1?
I have not, no.
Okay. So is it something you can jump into, like, you don't need to play the first one?
As far as I can tell, I think there were some references to characters from the original, but it didn't seem like the story arc in 2 was mostly self-contained.
And then these are JRPGs, is that right? Like,
Yeah,
are they turn-based?
yeah, definitely. I would
Okay.
describe it as a JRPG, maybe with sort of some of the monster collecting aspect. It's a little different, and I guess I'll try to get into some of that because the combat. So it's funny because I have 3 I would call JRPGs on my list of games I've enjoyed in 2021, and I like each of them for different reasons. And Monster Hunter Stories 2 probably has the weakest story of the 3. So I probably enjoyed the story the least, but I mean, it's still Monster Hunter. I really like that aesthetic. Like, it's very colorful and vibrant, and like, they have a lot of interesting settings and biomes, and you have a huge variety of monsters. And the characters are kind of colorful. And I guess the stories, the plot or the setting kind of focuses on quote unquote monster riders. So one of the things that's kind of neat is sometimes, the riders kind of meet the hunters, and it's not always like a friendly relationship. But yeah, I would say like the things I enjoyed about stories relative to some of the other JRPGs are, the setting. Some of the movement mechanics were pretty cool. Like they tie things, obviously in Monster Hunter Stories. So you're a monster rider, and part of the gameplay involves like collecting a team of quote unquote monsties, which are made up. If you played a Monster Hunter game, it's all those familiar monsters. Like, so early on, I had like a Kulu-Yaku on my team, and like a Velocidrome, and like then progressed into like a Nargacuga, and each of them sort of has like an overworld movement ability. So like our Nargacuga, for example, has a stealth ability, and some monsters can do like jumps and things like that. So it seems like a lot of the aspects of the gameplay they tie to the monsters. And I guess like it's a little hard to describe. I guess one other thing to say is like it has some of the stuff you might expect from a Monster Hunter game in terms of like some of the polish, some of the like systems, and like really good post game. So that's one thing I enjoyed about it. The combat and gameplay references Monster Hunter a lot, so like knowing a monster's elemental weaknesses, knowing like which parts to attack with which weapons, like knowing like what attack patterns it might use. Some of that you obviously have to learn kind of within the game and its own RPG mechanics, but it still was kind of neat to be like, oh, this is like a Tobi Kadachi. Like I think it's weak to fire, so let me like pull out like my fire weapon and call in like my the fire guy on my team and like see if that's right. So there are some kind of like neat references. It tries to be pretty consistent with the way it's like JRPG mechanics sort of reference the series.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff feels like it would fit very well in with like a turn-based RPG, like all the elemental stuff and targeting different parts of the body and all that. That seems like a pretty natural fit.
Yeah, they do a really good job with that, and I think especially in the post game, some of the fights felt really well balanced, and there was definitely like the combat is more complex than you might expect for like what is presented as sort of like a kid's sort of like a game targeted at younger audiences. So in each battle, you have like your rider who sort of has like a a subset of like a Monster Hunter weapon loadout. So like you could have like a great sword, a bow and arrow, and like a hammer. And like so you can have these different weapons, like a blunt, a piercing, and a slashing type weapon. And then, you have your monster who might be like a power type monster, a technical type monster, or a speed type monster. And so like the opposing monster will kind of indicate, a lot of times it'll indicate like at the beginning of the turn, like if it's going to go head to head with somebody. So like if the opposing monster is going head to head with me, like I might want to use like, let's say a power attack because I think it's going to use a technical attack. And I know that, it's kind of like a rock, paper, scissors thing. And so like there's actually kind of a lot of strategy around like saying, okay, well, I think this type of monster, when it's enraged, it might behave differently too. But I think this type of monster is going to do this type of attack. And like, since it's attacking me, I'm going to try to counter it with like a skill or attack that counters what it's doing. And then, I'm going to try to line up my partner, like the monster that's with me, to do the same thing and like kind of like double counter it and like cancel its attack. So those are it's a little tough to explain, I guess, especially just talking through it, but it ends up being like a pretty engaging like combat layer. And then of course you've got, like I talked about, the movement that's tied to the monsters, sort of the monster collection stuff that's, I wouldn't describe it as quite Pokemon-esque, but it's sort of in the same general wheelhouse. And so it does a lot of things that were cool, and I really got into some of like some of the post-game encounters and stuff like that. Like, guess that kind of is.
Yeah, that game does seem neat.
I think I'm the only one who played it this year, but it was fun. It looked cool, but I ended up liking some of the gameplay a lot more than maybe I expected.
Yeah, that's in the if I played a lot of long games, I'd probably be willing to check that out. So our final question, and then we'll move on. So are monsties just smaller versions of the normal monsters, or what are monsties?
I kind of wish, like, so I don't know why they call them monsties. I think monsties are basically just tame monsters, usually hatched from eggs. And then they have these kinship stone things, which look like these little glowing stones, and I guess that's how they communicate with the monsters. I don't know why they do that. Like, they could just make it like that, these people like learn how to tame or befriend these monsters. But yeah, monsties I think are just tame monsters.
Okay. So like you could have a Kulu-Yaku monstie in your party and then also fight like a monster-sized untamed Kulu-Yaku.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Gotcha. Cool deal. Well, that is Monster Hunter Stories 2. Is that the full name of the game?
Wings of Ruin, I think, is like
Wings
the
of Ruin.
subtitle.
And with that, we are moving on to our final game, The Forgotten City. And we did not forget it. We are going to talk about it.
Don't spoil it.
All right, so what happens at the end of Forgotten City, the true ending?
I just started it today. Don't spoil it for me. Seems pretty cool.
Weird. I'll give a quick setup, and then I'll toss it to you, Nate, and you can take the lead on what you liked about it. But it's kind of a weird sub theme for the year of time loop games, and the Forgotten City is one of them, which originally came out in like 2015 or something as a Skyrim mod, but they like fully redid it from the ground up. Actually, because the setting of the original mod was Skyrim setting, so like all the Roman setting is brand new, and they redid everything from the ground up, and I obviously really liked it. It was pretty high on my list, and I'll get to why I like it as well. But Nate, why don't you kick us off with what you liked about it?
So yes, it is a time loop game. You find yourself transported back to an ancient Roman city that is, just, I guess, spoil the premise, but I won't go beyond that.
This is all intro stuff.
Yeah, operating under a golden rule where if anybody in the city sins, then everybody dies. And so there's a lot of dialogue between all the citizens of the city. It's not a ton of people, so you get to know all the characters pretty well. They all have different motivations and backstories and things that you need from them or that they might want you to do. So it is largely focused on kind of unraveling who those characters are and how they relate to each other and what buttons you can press to get outcomes you want as a time loop game. So you can kind of try things and see what happens and then try to use that knowledge the next loop to do things differently. And so that core idea just works, and it has really good writing. They have a lot of good ideas about what it means to have a city like this and what the characters would think about that. And they all feel like real people that you could imagine being in this kind of city. One thing that I really appreciate is that they don't try to like Romanize the dialogue, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's all, and they even have a throwaway line at the beginning where your character's like, "Why are you speaking English?" And they're like, "Why are you speaking Roman?" And they're like, "Okay, some magic spell is going on here to translate everything for you. It doesn't really matter." But they all just talk in like modern English, and it's very funny to me.
Except where they do say Solway. Like
that's true. They do say a couple random words like that, which probably doesn't actually make sense, but works fine.
Yeah, there's a little inconsistency there, but
I mean, Fake Musicom, you know?
I have noticed whenever they call people other people by unpleasant names, they usually use some Latin pejorative, which I have no idea what it means.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of characters in there who aren't actually Roman. Like there's one Greek guy, and I think the one guy is German, maybe, or Austrian or something.
Yeah, might be.
So there are a couple other characters that I guess the magic allows them to communicate with each other.
Yeah, whatever. It does a really good job of setting up a lot of hooks very quickly, a lot of mysteries and questions, and gives you your core goal of finding a way out of this time loop, which centers are a lot around like figuring out who is going to commit a sin that will cause the time loop to be created originally, because that's all tied up in how the game starts. It's just a lot of good pushing and pulling of levers and like uncovering those mysteries.
Yeah, the first, like the head honcho guy you meet with at the start, he tells you like someone has sin that created the time loop, or he knows someone's about to sin or something like that. So like you're kind of you put on your detective hat and you're like, he asks you to figure out like who is going to sin, and we need to find them so that we can get out of this time loop or whatever.
Then following those threads uncovers a whole lot of other stuff.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's what I like. I mean, I like a lot of things about this game. Like, one point I want to re-stress that Nate already said is, like, I think the writing is really good and really smart. And I think they play around in the writing, they play around with both the idea of the time loop as a concept, but also the main theme of the game is the golden rule. The sins of the many shall suffer for the sins of the one is the thing they keep, the mantra they keep saying. But there's a whole lot of like philosophical writing and dialogue in the game from all sorts of characters of like what constitutes a sin, what does that mean? Like, who defines what a sin is? Like, what is right and wrong? Like, there's a whole lot. Like, that's really the main theme of the game. And I feel like they had, like, to me, I feel like they address it really well. And like by the time you see the endings, it's like I feel like they found a good like game setup to like have those, kind of go through those deliberations. And they do really smart things. So this is maybe the slightest bit spoilery. I don't think it's that spoilery, but there's one character in the game. His name is Dooley. And he is how would you describe him? Like a disabled or mentally impaired, or
Yeah.
He's maybe not quite all there. So he doesn't really understand laws and rules. So basically, like if he were to roam free, he would just steal willy-nilly because he just doesn't understand things. So he's kind of like quarantined, and like people are afraid that he'll get out and, sin. But then his court is like keeping him locked up. Is that bad? Like it poses just a lot of questions like that of like, oh, how do you handle, these kind of situations? And I think it just handles that stuff really well. And then I think in the detective side of it, like mechanically, how it uses the time loop is really smart. Cause like Nate said, it kind of like, it almost like pushes you to like commit sins, to like just test the barriers, to like poke, to poke at the seams. And then it's like, whoops, that that's gonna reset us. But because it's a time loop, it's like pretty forgiving in that way of like, oh yeah, if you goof up, you restart. And then I think just the way all the mysteries intertwine, like I think because they kind of give you that one starting thread, but then there are all sorts, as Nate alluded to, there are all sorts of other character threads and mysteries that pop up. And I think the way they all interweave is really smart, because a lot of what happens is if you start following one lead, you're going to cross over other threads along the way. So like kind of anywhere you start picking is going to get you something. And like, I think that's just a really smart way to design this kind of interweaving mystery. And I thought all of it was really fun to uncover. I thought the true ending was kind of bonkers. And there were some wild revelations there. I think kind of the last comment, I think this game just has a lot of really smart little touches. One final one I'll comment on is there's one character who like, he's the first guy you see every time you like start a new loop. And like, if there's something you accomplished in a previous loop, you can like, as you start a new loop, you can just tell him to go do it for you. You're like, hey man, can you go do this thing for me? And he's just like, oh, sure, friend, I'll take care of it. And so it's like, and that list of things like grows as it goes on. So it's like, basically mechanically what that means is you don't have to repeat things you've done before, because you can just delegate this other guy to go do it at the beginning of every loop.
Also, he's just a very nice guy.
He is a very nice man. I like him a lot. He is my friend.
That is really funny. I think I've done I'm on my second loop, and like talking to him the second time was pretty amusing.
Yeah.
That relationship with that character Galerius is hilarious. The more you just keep unloading on him, and he's like, "All right, cool, man."
I got your back.
Even the very first time he asked me, because you're like, the game setting is like that you're from kind of the modern era, and you get sent to the past, and you're like, yeah, I'm from the future, and he's like, are you a little messed up in the head?
Yeah. He's great. I love him. I like a lot of the characters as well. The Greek guy cracks me up. Georgius.
Yeah, Georgius.
He's so funny. He's like sleazy salesman, but he pulls it off so well. Yeah, it just, I really had a good time with this one. You got any final thoughts, Nate?
It's really cool.
And with that is our 11 games. To recap the list in the order we talked about them, we talked about Chicory, A Colorful Tale, Boomerang X, Psychonauts 2, Loop Hero, Hitman 3, Wildermyth, Monster Hunter Rise, Unsighted, Stonefly, Monster Hunter Stories 2, and The Forgotten City. And I think it's interesting looking back at this list, because kind of as we were talking about up front, as like a very diverse list of games that we just went through. Like, not many of those are like any other game on the list.
Cool group of games for sure.
Yeah. And I think that's also a very good 11 games to kind of represent our collective tastes and what grabbed us this year. So I like this list. I'm into it.
Solid.
I agree.
Solid list
Good
indeed.
conversation.
Yeah.
Good year. Next year, there's a lot of good games to look forward to as well. But I'm happy with what we got in 2021.
Indeed. And I think with that, barring any other parting words from any of you all, we'll wrap up this Game of the Year 2021 chat. Call it a podcast.
Put a bow on it.
Put a bow on this 2021. See ya. Time for out with the old, in with the new. That's what I always say. Yeah?
I heard you say it all the time.
All the time. I have been Flex, joined by Nate, Ryan, and Will. You've been listening to Atacs Game of the Year 2021 episode. Thank you for listening, and we will see you again next time.